Hello.
Hello.
So we've been talking all morning about regulating tech. One of the things that I guess heard in my prior conversation with FTC Commissioner Noah Phillips was that a big part of drawing up the regulation, figuring out what needs to be regulated, is figuring out what actually are the harms that attach to privacy. What should consumers be worried about, and what really are they worried about? Nicole, I actually want to point this question to you first. What do you think, and it's looking ahead, not only at the harms that we've already seen unfold in various breaches of privacy, but to some of the harms that we can anticipate about the way that data is being used. What do you think should be at the forefront of regulators' minds?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me here. I'm excited to have this conversation because we're having this conversation in DC all the time. So I think what the commissioner pointed out in terms of what's a harms-based approach is actually an interesting approach, right? I think the perfect storm happened last year with the Cambridge Analytica scandal. It was post-Snowden, but it took people by surprise as to how their data was actually being collected, harvested, and shared, in this case, among political operatives, foreign operatives. So I think we're in a different state now, whereas before, particularly in the US, we were concerned with, the collection of data. Now I think consumers are really concerned about what that data looks like when it's shared. And when it's shared in a non-transparent, obscure way on a very opaque internet. A place where people really don't know where the touch points are. And when it lands up doing something to your latter point of your question, where it surveils, or it profiles, or it discriminates, or it targets, it becomes particularly troubling, right? For consumers that, in my work, have already been on the wrong side of the digital divide or experiencing some level of systemic inequality. So I think looking forward, we have to figure out how do we do this balancing act of what ethical sharing and responsible sharing looks like in privacy. And that's a conversation that's going to require some level of guardrails, right, in terms of people knowing how their data is going to be used, as well as some level of stewardship, I think, from the companies that are collecting that data, that they're actually going to use it for the things that they intend to. I don't want to go on and have this mega footprint of my digital profile as an African-American woman and know that I'm being marketed higher interest credit cards, or because I am a mother of two, that somehow they figured out through inferential assumptions about my lifestyle or my digital activity that I'm actually within this box. So I think those are the harms that I'm particularly concerned about. I do want all the other stuff. I want Netflix to tell me what movie to watch, and I want a big box store to recommend what product to actually get. But I don't want to be placed in a box where that creates systemic inequality, because I'm already battling that in the offline space.
Jason, I know that you pay close attention, given your role, to the emerging policy directions that seem to be coalescing here in DC. And I'm curious, now that GDPR is in effect, as CCPA, California's act, prepares to go into effect, what do you think the policy consensus currently is around what should be in comprehensive federal privacy law?
Yeah, I think, first of all, there's a consensus that there should be a federal privacy law, and that's a big step right there. The industry is united. I think consumer groups are united. I think we have broad agreement that because the tech industry has lost the trust of its customers, as Nicole so eloquently put, we do need a federal privacy law regime. It needs to be uniform. It needs to adopt certain principles that restore the consumer trust in our industry that we need so desperately. ITI has actually published principles, we call them FAIR principles, that we hope will be an effective roadmap for that legislation. The ability of consumers to look to their government for protection where they feel as if an industry has let them down is really what drove the consensus around the need for federal legislation. And I think if we can establish, again, at a national level, something that consumers can feel comfortable with, something where they can say, oh, I don't have any problem with the use of information. I feel as if my privacy is being protected by the industry because the government has established a framework for the industry to adopt. I think that gets us back to where we need to be.
Mm. One of the harms that's often raised in the conversation is the harm to innovation and entrepreneurship, that we have to be careful about setting a regulatory framework that doesn't chill the ability of innovators in the U.S. to develop new and exciting products. Now, Frida, as someone who is an entrepreneur and has developed a new and exciting product, I'm curious how you think about balancing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I think that, there's some truth to that. However, they say necessity is the mother of invention. So I don't think we can really use, some sort of a, regulatory environment as a reason for why innovation can't still happen. And I think that we would all agree that certain types of innovation may not be the types of innovation that we want to see. So I think it's about a balance. And I think, earlier I said something around the fact that Pymetrics is in the predictive hiring space. It's regulated by laws that regulate all products in the space, not just technology products. And I think that we've seen regulation both help us in terms of becoming more innovative, and also slow growth of adoption of our product, which we actually believe fosters much more fairness in hiring than some of the more dated products that are in market. And so what I mean by that is that, and I'm getting in the weeds, but the EEOC specifies that you can't have adverse impact against protected classes, which of course we completely agree with, and therefore we've created a system where we audit our algorithms ahead of time so that we can show companies, hey, we're not seeing this adverse impact. A lot of times what would traditionally happen is that the tool would go live and then you would find the adverse impact. So we're sort of preempting that because of the idea that this regulation is going to be applied to us, and because we're a new technology product, may even be applied more stringently actually than to some of the sort of non-tech products that are out there in the hiring space. So in that sense, I think it's actually made us more innovative because we've gotten a lot of attention, I guess, for putting out this algorithm auditing technique and so forth. I think the flip side is that sometimes older tools don't get as much scrutiny, which I think is actually a little bit not ideal, because I don't think AI, just because my company does AI and yours doesn't, I don't think it should be more highly scrutinized than some older product that is potentially discriminating also, but it's not the hot button topic of the day. So.
Another conduit, Nicole, I want to ask you about this. Another way or caution that's been raised about introducing a new regulatory framework is that it can actually lock in the advantages of established players. I asked the commissioner about this just a minute ago, but Nicole, Mark Zuckerberg came out in the Washington Post and said, GDPR me. Like, just let's build on the framework that's been established by GDPR to regulate Facebook. What do you think the U.S. should be learning from GDPR? And I'd say also, what should we be learning from CCPA?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when Zuckerberg comes out and says GDPR me, it's sort of unfair to small businesses and entrepreneurs that cannot comply with, I think, the restrictions that GDPR has. I mean, for those of you who are not as familiar, the GDPR, which was really an enactment about 6 years ago that just adopted again around this perfect storm, is really about, data compliance, and they have several regulatory agencies that ensure a high level of enforcement. For those of us who are lay people, when we started getting all those announcements like click here, click here, click here, a lot of it was because companies had to go through the pressure of being GDPR compliant and making sure that people knew, that their data was being collected. The same token, though, Europe has a different standard when it comes to innovation. So it is somewhat surprising that Zuckerberg would say GDPR me, but then again, Facebook can be GDPR'd, if that is a verb, right? Because they have enough people working for them to actually be in compliance. There were a lot of companies, my friends, that when the GDPR went into adoption, their websites shut down. Companies like USA Today, they were not compliant the day of adoption, and people were no longer able to get them. And so I think we have to be careful about that. There's a lot of value, I think, and I think Jason would agree, in terms of principles, and where our how our data actually moves through the internet and what the GDPR is attempting to do, similar to the California law. The challenge is, when you are dealing with federal regulation, you cannot have a patchwork of state laws, because that actually defeats the purpose. And you can't have something so rigid that it locks down the ability of companies like Frida to innovate. We need compliance that in the United States that I think we had a discussion about this, which I'm in total agreement, that is clear enough with some level of ambiguity that allows for innovative growth and for actors to come into the space where they can actually do it at a level that they're most comfortable where they can make the investment. We don't want, as part of the privacy debate, to sort of galvanize all aspects of the internet. We commonly talk about those big players, but when you think about it, and I'm particularly excited about it as a person of color who's worked on this, is that the internet has provided the low-hanging fruit to a whole new marketplace. So as we go into the privacy debate, we need to ensure that whatever we put in place, right, is not going to implode various aspects of how the web actually operates. So yeah, I would say to him, great job, Mark, but it's not for everybody, right? If I could actually talk to him like that. Because, there are obviously, different enforcement mechanisms that are very different than it is in the United States, and a lot of compliance issues.
Jason, let me ask you a version of that question. What can the U.S. do now? I mean, some would say we're behind and now we're just responding to what's already out there legislatively. And so what can the U.S. do to perhaps reset the terms of the debate in a way that's protective both of consumers and of businesses?
Yeah, and I think Nicole alluded to it. The first and most important thing, and this is something that GDPR actually accomplished that not a lot of people remember. There used to be 28 separate European privacy regimes, and what GDPR did is they took 28 or 27, depending on what the UK does, and unified it into one for the entire continent. And that was enormously helpful to innovators, and that's one thing that we're really looking to Congress to do here, is not adopt the 51st privacy regime for the United States, but adopt one. And because, as Nicole mentioned, data services can't respect borders automatically. AI doesn't know what state it's in. That's enormously helpful. And then as far as the principles that are adopted, as I mentioned before, our principles at ITI are focused on restoring consumer trust. Let's make sure that consumers, as Commissioner Phillips said, know what they're getting into when they start using a service. They know what their data is used for. They have an ability to make a choice about what their data is used for. They can respect their own privacy, or they can make the choice, as Noah said, to go use somebody else's service. Those are the kind of things that we're looking for Congress to help establish in order to rebuild the trust. But I think the important thing to remember there is that for the technology industry, for innovators in the industry, having that kind of roadmap is enormously helpful. GDPR may not be the best solution on the planet, but it's the one that's out there right now. And one of the reasons you're hearing technology companies say, well, let's base US legislation on principles adopted in GDPR is because we're all complying with it already. We are a global industry. And if that's the roadmap that's out there already, let's use that to influence what we do here in the US because we're already partway there as far as compliance.
Yeah. Frida, and before I mention I'm going to ask the audience a question in just a moment, but I wanted to ask you, what do you think that what do you think that the regulators, what would you ask regulators for, essentially, as an entrepreneur? What do you think, what's the best way for the regulatory environment to provide a framework and provide the necessary guidance?
Yeah, I mean, again, I agree with what the other panelists said in terms of norms, coming up with norms, whether it's transparency, fairness, accountability, and so on. I also think it's, really important to be educated on the fact that, technology is neutral. Fire is technology, electricity is technology. They can kill you, they can keep you alive, right? It's the same with AI. AI has huge promise. I was speaking with you earlier about how AI, in my opinion, and from what I've seen, has great promise to actually reduce human bias in a whole bunch of different things. Mm-hmm. And it's always funny when people say, oh, that terrible biased AI. And I'm like, well, AI is really just, the definition is that it's a computer that's mimicking a human process. So if you don't like what the computer is doing, you probably didn't like what the humans did before. So who should you be picking on, really? The poor AI that is just, dumbly following the humans. But anyways, all joking aside, I think we should really just view technology as neutral, and I think it's the design of the technology that is the critical piece. It is the intention of the technologists who designed that. And it is really, you know, sometimes even the business model behind the company that one should be more skeptical of, I think, than potentially just AI or data or some big sort of category. So that's what I would ask regulators to think about, is these are huge buckets of things that you really can't ascribe a particular valence to. You really have to get into the particular aspects of how these things are being used.
Yeah. Let's go to a question over here in the audience.
Dina Stoner, Cooperative Finance Corporation. I come out of the energy and electricity industry. And when efficiency became a major, major issue, there was an assumption that all consumers could just do what you're saying. Mm-hmm. If you don't like the privacy here, move your service to someplace else. But that assumes a rational understanding of the marketplace, and most people don't have it. So they came up with a standard: gold, silver, bronze, or whatever. And it would seem to me that for the average consumer, if I knew I'm buying something and it gets a gold, mm-hmm. and I don't have to understand what it is, but you do, and somebody's checking it, it would be very helpful. Mm-hmm. How do you react to that?
Yeah, if I may. Sure. I think that's a great example. If we look at the Energy Star program, which is a phenomenal partnership between government and the private sector that provides consumers very clear information, disclosure about the energy usage of appliances, so I as a consumer can choose certain features that I want or don't want based on how important energy efficiency is to me. Mm-hmm. Started off as a potential for a government mandate because there was concern about energy efficiency, moved very, very quickly to a public-private partnership. I think that's the kind of thing we're looking for in the tech sector to address these data and privacy issues. And again, Commissioner Phillips, I think, set out a nice roadmap where Congress says, here are the things that you need to do to protect consumers' privacy, which, by the way, is a constitutional principle, not optional. Not optional. But industry, let's make sure you're providing the disclosure, the information that consumers need to make an effective choice. They know what's happening to their data and information and can choose what to buy, if you will, as a result of that.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's a great idea in terms of, how do we get companies to sort of exercise this competition, right, be it among consumers. But I think you've got to start with baseline privacy, right, so that you have an area where people can strive for. These are unregulated industries, and as a result of that, we sort of are operating in this permissionless forgiveness state, which allows people to err and then correct, and err and correct. And I think until we have some baseline standards, what are you striving for? What's the definition of privacy that's important? I think we can then actually implement that. We're doing a paper, shameless plug, at Brookings on algorithmic bias detection and mitigation. But we're actually speaking to that quality of how people actually assess from the operator side, what goes into good algorithmic hygiene, from the consumer side, what are good feedback loops and audits, to how we as policymakers ensure that we balance innovation with that type of conversation. If we do it right, and one of our partners is actually the Better Business Bureau, we can actually get to a point where we're framing the conversation around this good hygiene that allows people to sort of jump into the game and let the internet know what's working and what's not.
And with that, Jason, Nicole, Frida, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.